तमसो मा ज्योतिर्गमय तमसो मा ज्योतिर्गमय तमसो मा ज्योतिर्गमय तमसो मा ज्योतिर्गमय
पंजाब विश्वविद्यालय तेरी शान और शौकत सदा रहे, मन में तेरा आदर मान और मोहब्बत सदा रहे। पंजाब विश्वविद्यालय तेरी शान और शौकत सदा रहे।
तू है अपना भविष्य विधाता, पंख बिना परवान सिखाता, जीवन पुस्तक रोज पढ़ाकर सही गलत की समझ बढ़ाता।
जीवन पुस्तक रोज पढ़ाकर सही गलत की समझ बढ़ाता।
तेरी जय गौ शंख बजाए,
रोशन तारे बन जाए,
बखरी तेरी शोहरत, तेरी शोहरत सदा सदा रहे।
विश्वविद्यालय तेरी शान और शौकत सदा रहे। पंजाब विश्वविद्यालय तेरी शान और शौकत सदा रहे।
तमसो मा ज्योतिर्गमय तमसो मा ज्योतिर्गमय।
Namaskar and greetings of the day. On the behalf of the Department of Philosophy, Panjab University, Chandigarh, I welcome you all to the lecture series on philosophy of science conducted under the ICPR sponsored study circle Objections. As an introductory note, I wish to submit that Professor Edouard Machery, who is a professor at the Department of History and Philosophy of Science, University of Pittsburgh, who is also a member at the Center for Neural Bases of Cognition at University of Pittsburgh, has recently started conducting lecture series on philosophy of science by roping in different scholars and academicians from different institutes and universities. We approached him to collaborate with Department of Philosophy, Panjab University, Chandigarh, for streaming and broadcasting these lecture series for the benefit of Indian mind, for the Indian young scholars, teachers and faculty. And I'm glad to share that he has very kindly consented and agreed to our proposal. I also put it on record for the efforts made by Piyush Parimoo for concretizing this academic venture. It is for our viewers to know that there will be an attendance certificate for every lecture under the joint signatures of University of Pittsburgh, and Department of Philosophy, Panjab University, Chandigarh. Today, Liam Coffey Bright, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Philosophy, Logic and Scientific Method at the London School of Economics, who is also an MSc in Philosophy of Science and has completed his PhD in Logic Computation, speaks on scientific conclusions need not be accurate, justified, or believed by their authors. I believe that this lecture and the deliberations that will be made will not only benefit us intellectually, not only it will enrich us, but it will leave us with certain insightful questions too. So I wish you all well and hope that you enjoy the lecture. Thank you.
Talks and events at the center will be online. The bad thing, of course, that we will not be able to have the usual corridor discussions and rubbing elbows. The good thing is that many of you who are not in Pittsburgh, including some of our speakers, including our speaker today, will be able to join some of the events of the center. So that's an opportunity for us to broaden our reach and to invite more people to join the Center for Philosophy of Science community. I wanted to first introduce our fellows. As some of you know, the center welcomes 5 fellows each semester, plus 2 postdocs, plus a senior visiting fellow. So this year, for fall 2020, we only have 1 postdoc due to pandemic reason, and the senior visiting fellow, Nick Huggett, will only start in spring. But still, we have 4 fellows and 1 postdoc. So I will introduce them. They can't say hi to you, given that we use webinar, the webinar function of Zoom. But I wanted to mention them. Diane Francis, who worked on the philosophy of medicine. Mac Pedroso, who work in the philosophy of biology. Nick Fillon, who works on the philosophy of applied math. Ed Slovic, who worked in history and philosophy of physics. And Mike Schneider, who is our postdoc and work in the philosophy of physics, as well as issues in applied ethics and formal ethics. You will hear for all of them, they will be giving lectures this semester during the lunchtime talks, and hopefully you have some opportunities to talk to them. So what are the events of the center happening at the center this semester during fall? We have a lot of talks. The first one, the first series of talk is the lunchtime talks, which will be happening on Tuesdays and Fridays, pretty much throughout the semester. They last for 90 minutes, 1 hour lecture, 55 minutes lecture, half an hour question, and then we are done. For Fridays, there will be the annual lecture series talk, and the first talk will be happening on September 25th. It's a 1 hour talk followed by a 45-minute, 1 hour Q&A period. We also have a seminar in the philosophy of neuroscience on cognitive ontology, which will be starting on September 21st and happening every other week or every week, either on Monday or on Thursday. In addition, we have a new center event, a new center activity called the Center Debates. And we're going to try to bring people with different perspectives and even people who might disagree on a given topic of interest to philosophers of science, but also to scientists and lay public, to have an exchange between 2 scholars on a given topic of interest. And the first one of this event will be on October 6th, and the topic is fake news. So the center debates fake news with Colleen O'Connor from Irvine and Hugo Mercier from the CNRS in France. So Hugo Mercier is a cognitive scientist Kellyn O'Connor is a philosopher. So October 6th. You can find announcements for all these events on the center's website, and you can register for all these events online in order to join us for these events. Next week, we have 2 lunchtime talks. The first one on Tuesday by Mike Dietrich, and the first one on Friday at noon by Mark Wilson, both from Pitt. Mike Dietrich from Pitt HPS, Mark Wilson from Pitt Philosophy. And again, you can register for these 2 talks on the center website. Now, so that's for the events, what I wanted to tell you to introduce the events at the center. The last 2 things I want to do is to tell you a bit about the mechanics. Since most of you have used Zoom to teach, but not Zoom, maybe not Zoom webinar. So for Zoom webinar, in contrast to the usual Zoom function, only the speaker and the hosts are visible, namely at this time, me and Liam. The attendees are not able to participate, they are not visible. So the way it's going to work, we're going to have a 1-hour lecture, and then we're going to have a 30-minute Q&A. For the 30-minute Q&A, I'd like you to look down at the bottom of your screen and to look at the Q&A function. You can click on Q&A, and then you can write your name there. If you write your name, I will assume that you have a question for Liam during the Q&A part of this meeting, and I will promote you to a host status, so that you'll be able to ask a question to Liam and to talk directly to him. After that, it takes a few seconds to transition from just being an attendee to being a participant. So don't be surprised if you are transitioning for a few seconds. You'll be able to ask your question to Liam, and then I will move you back to the attendee stages, and so on and so forth. And I'll go through the list of people who have put their name in the Q&A box. I hope it's clear enough about how we're going to be proceeding. And now, last but not least, I wanted to introduce Liam Bright, the speaker of the day. So thank you, Liam, for being the first speaker this semester. The talks are always amazing. The first talk is always amazing this semester, so I hope we won't be disappointed. I'm just teasing you. Liam works in the Department of Philosophy, Logic and Scientific Method at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Some of you may know him because he did his PhD at Carnegie Mellon University with Kevin Solman a few years ago. He works on a range of areas: philosophy of science, formal and social epistemology, and Africana philosophy. He has been very influential on some of these topics. And he has published in all the best journals in philosophy of science and elsewhere. It's actually not a joke. It's actually a true fact about you, Liam. Philosophy of science, BGPS, and so on and so forth, on topics such as fraud, peer review, and issues related to the social epistemology of science. Particularly noteworthy is the fact that his 2017 paper in philosophical studies on fraud was selected to be as one of the best 10 papers of the year and was published in the 2017 Philosophers Annual. His most recent paper, at least the one I've read most recently, is on peer review. Is peer review a good idea? Just published in Philosophy of Science. And I quite agree with him about what he says in that paper, abolish peer review. All right, that's about it as an introduction. Liam, the floor is yours. You have about 50 minutes.
Okay, hi everyone. No, I actually suspect that the talk might actually come in a bit under, so that will give us more time for everyone to ask me sort of nice, chill questions that in no way probe me or are mean, because it's Friday night. I don't need that in my life. Be chill. Okay, so my talk is about, well, the title's the conclusion. Scientific conclusions need not be accurate, justified, or believed by their authors. Before we get going properly, I should say it's a co-authored work. Oh, naturally, it's not working. Oh, there it is. With Hai-Sin Dang. Hai-Sin Dang is the one on the left. See, the other good thing about this format is I can just assume all my jokes are landing. You will love me. It's going great. I like this. Okay, so Haisen Dang, the one on the left, she's actually the first author, and she is a former Pitt HPS graduate. She's got her PhD at HPS. And not only she's first author, but actually it's kind of relevant here because there's a in the paper this is based on, there's a case study, there's a historical case study, which was really Haisin's work. I don't know it in as much detail, so I won't really be able to answer questions about the case study as much. I apologize for that in advance. But the good thing for this audience is that case study, this kind of the thing which inspired the work as a whole in many ways, was actually based on Haisin's comp. It was based on her work that she did to get through the degree program in HPS. So if it's bad, it's your fault really, and so you definitely can't ask questions. So I accept no responsibilities for any errors, and in fact I blame you, the audience. Okay, so before getting into the meat of the paper, they talk about like the big picture here. So like, what's the sort of the thing which got Haisin and I thinking about this? And so you can think of like the big picture question, something like, what are we licensed to infer from the fact that something appears as a conclusion to a published article when all is going well? I'm going to say a bit more, defining some of those terms in a moment. But like what we're thinking about here is kind of like science is a big process, and sort of on the whole, we want to be able to trust what comes out of it. But for the big process to work and for the big process to reach trustworthy conclusions, it requires lots and lots of mini inputs. So like the science as a whole, and then there's particular labs or particular researchers putting out their individual work. And we're sort of interested in what's the relationship between the whole and the part. Like how did the miniature, the subunits contribute to the success or failure of the enterprise considered broadly? And in particular, actually, we got to think about this because of the replication crisis. Because often we were kind of interested in things, often what seemed to be happening in some, not in every case. I mean, there were many, many causes of replication crisis. We're not going to say this is the only one, but one of the things that seemed to be going on is you would get people, for instance, starting consultancies based on published papers they were just doing in psychology. And it was sort of like rushing straight from, well, we just published a paper or two studying this phenomena, to like giving seminars to businesses and charging money for it. And then this contributed both to the reality and the perception of a replication crisis, when it turns out many things thus rushed through didn't really work. And that got us thinking about this question of the replication crisis, which is, why is it a crisis, right? Like, is at least some of the issue, and there are many issues, I said, it's really not the whole thing, but is at least some of the issue something like, not so much like what the, I'm trying to say, it's at least the issue like expecting from science. It'd be a crisis for papers which are like just published not to turn out to replicate. Like, what's the expected rate of replication? How many of such things should work? So at least some of the issue might be something to do with our attitude to the particular published units in science. And so that was another motivating factor. So, pardon me. So to define terms a bit more precisely, what I mean when all is going well. So this is some idealizing assumptions for the sake of the talk, but in the Q&A, if you want to ask nicely about these, happy to talk more. So when all is going well, we're going to be thinking about like cases where the scientific community is well arranged to bring about desirable epistemic results. So we're imagining that like whatever, like the individual process as a whole, if the individual units do their part, then science will achieve knowledge or truth or empirical adequacy or whatever it is we want science as a whole to achieve. And so, it could happen that the scientific community is just so badly set up that no matter what the individual units do, it doesn't really matter because the whole enterprise is badly conducted. And that might happen with some fields, like maybe, what's the phrenology, the one where they fill up your head? Like, maybe that was a field like that where it just didn't really matter how careful you were with your skull measurements. It just was never going to be good. But we're not thinking about cases like that. Assume it's a sort of basically well-run enterprise achieving sort of desirable epistemic goals. And secondly, let's assume that the conclusion that's been reached, the thing we're going to be interested in, are cases where the researcher hasn't committed fraud, they followed the best practices, they haven't made any silly errors. And so insofar as this thing has been concluded, it's the result of like someone working according to the standards of a field in a field where it's generally doing okay, achieving epistemic goals. And so any problems you might have with the conclusion, any sort of lack of epistemic status, is not because either the field or the subunit are just mistakes or errors or done poorly or something like that. They're trying to think about like the good case. Okay, so that's what we mean by that. And our idea here, when we got thinking about this, was to sort of borrow work that's been done in analytic philosophy of language and analytic epistemology, where people have really been thinking about like norms which govern when assertions can be made. And so the thought is that there are lots of different proposed norms, and I'll talk about that in a second. But the thought is, when I assert something about how the world is, for it to be a felicitous assertion, maybe even for it to count as the thing which is assertion, it has to be sort of held to certain kind of norms, and if it's a good one, achieve those norms. And so maybe, for instance, a good assertion is a true assertion. In that case, it's kind of failed qua assertion if I say something and it's false. Or maybe if it's not the kind of thing which has to at least try and be true, then it doesn't count as an assertion or something like that. And so our thought was that like maybe the conclusion of scientific papers like could be seen as like what the paper's asserting about the world. And so, if you have a paper on the sociology of mobile phone use in a city, and it concludes that in 2007 there was an uptick in mobile phone use, then that, what the paper has done is like in the end try to like assert this about the world, that mobile phone use has gone up in this particular year. And it's done so, and it has like an argument to justify that. That was kind of our first guess proposal, and it turns out we can argue that that doesn't work. But we thought it was a fairly natural first guess, and so like it's interesting to learn that it fails, and also you'll see that why it fails is kind of informative about the relationship between the subunits and the whole. Oh yeah, so this is just to be a bit precise about what's meant by assertion, because there are, about conclusion of scientific paper, we call them public avowals, or scientific public avowals, actually that's going to be important. So we're going to say utterances made by scientists aimed at informing the wider scientific community of some result obtained. So this can be conclusions in peer-reviewed papers, conference presentations or posters, online preprints, that sort of thing. And I think two things, they could be like marked out as the conclusion. Often such things will feature in the paper, both inclusive or might also always inclusive. And despite the somewhat misleading thing I did where I began like someone talking to a business consultancy, for now we're going to be thinking specifically about scientists talking to other scientists. So like the presumed audience for this kind of thing is whoever reads the journals in my field, or to a conference in my field or something like that. And the reason it's going to matter is because given what we're going to say, we think it might actually be reasonable to hold a sort of like outward facing, public facing utterances to different standards. And so it's kind of like that's where we want to focus for now. Okay, so here's the argument of what's going to follow. I said I don't actually think it's going to take too long, so hopefully we can all chill soon. Okay, so first I'm going to examine that case study, which I mentioned that was based on Hyocin's work. I'll just kind of really briefly summarize it, but it will sort of give you an example of the sort of thing you have in mind. And then I'll think about how to generalize from that, or like what sort of mechanisms are at play there, which allow for what happened to happen. And then I will consider an objection, just one, but it's the only sensible one, so do that. So we'll think about that objection, and then we'll conclude that we're right, and you'll agree, and it will be good. Okay, so okay, there is one more thing. A lot of setup. It's all good because it's all going to like fall into place. We're very naturally going to like it. Okay, so I mentioned we're going to look from the literature. We looked at literature and analytic epistemology on these norms of assertion. Well, we claim, as far as we could tell, we've shown this analytic epistemologists, they didn't tend to agree, that broadly speaking, roughly the popular ones, the ones people take seriously, as far as we can tell, they usually or mostly or maybe always fall into one of three categories. They both appear at once. Okay, so some of them are factive. I mentioned maybe an assertion's apt or felicitous only if it is true. So Obviously, you could just say good assertions have to be true. But another example of that might be good assertions have to be known, given that knowledge is factive. I think the knowledge norm is probably the individually most popular and widely accepted. I think Timothy Williamson made it famous. But there are other ways you could build in. So Jason Stanley at least mooted has to be known and certain in the right kind of way. But whatever, as long as they entail that a good assertion has to be true, then it counts as a factive one. Sometimes people have slightly weaker constraints where they say an assertion has to be at least justified, but maybe false. And so in these kind of cases, like as long as I'm warranted in making the assertion, or my evidence would justify it if I were to think rationally in the right kind of way, or something like that, then the assertion can be apt, and it can be apt even if it's not in fact true. What matters is I have the right kind of epistemic standing to make the claim. And then there are these second order norms, which is, assertion has to be apt, it has to be sort of believed to be true, or something along that line. So it doesn't matter necessarily whether I am actually right or I am actually justified. What matters is that it's like a sincerity point. I really take myself to be true or justified, and I believe these things. And so these are sort of most of the norms we found, all found in these, fell into these categories. As we got to thinking, is it the case that in the good case, and not necessarily in every case, but in the good case scientific papers, the conclusions or the public avowals in particular would fall into one of these categories, and we're going to argue that they don't. Okay, so here's the super rushed case study. But just to say, the reason I still include this, partly because, just to mention it, but also partly because if you're interested in this, the paper goes into far more detail, and there is a completed document available. It's not published yet, but it is available. And so we're happy to send it. And in fact, because it's not published, it would be useful to get comments. And so that's good. Okay, so the case study, such as it is about William Henry Bragg and X-rays. And so in the early 20th century, there was a lot of research among physicists on what we would now think of as X-rays. And people were sort of trying to work out what they are and what causes them. And Bragg in 1907, actually in a series of papers, argued that X-rays must have a particle component, that these partly must be composed of particles in some sense. However, he was wrong. It turned out, the thing we now call X-rays, he was wrong about what made him up. His theory was just incorrect. So his work, where he was kind of putting this theory forward, his conclusions, his scientific public avowals, they weren't true, and so they would have been bad according to a factive norm. Now they weren't justified. Now here's what we mean by that, and it's actually relevant to the second one. Bragg was kind of well aware that the sum total evidence didn't favor his claim. He was getting results suggestive of a particle component, but he was well aware that there was other work going on, and on the whole, it didn't justify his conclusion. On the whole, the evidence spoke against it. But despite that, in public, he made these claims at a particle component. And we know there was this difference between his public assertions and his public scientific public avowals and his private attitudes, because we actually have a bunch of diaries and correspondence of his, which is kind of what makes this nice, and I think we're very well informed about, where he just says, he admits to these things, and he says, well, I'm putting the idea out there because someone should defend this, and it'd be worth seeing how the community responds. But even if I'm wrong, it will be worth seeing how people respond, and someone has to explain my experimental results, and so I'm going to put forward the best case I can. And so because we have this, he didn't really believe what he was putting forward, and it wasn't fully justified given the total evidence, at least by his own appraisal, and we're not going to disagree with that. So given total evidence about the state of research on the what we now call X-rays, it wasn't justified, and he didn't believe it to be true or justified. And importantly for our purpose, he got a Nobel Prize. And like he didn't get a Nobel Prize for this work in particular. He got a Nobel Prize for something slightly later, but that was kind of indicative of the fact that everyone viewed this to be sort of a very successful episode. Science is still taught as a generally science well done. No one has ever read his correspondence, found out that the kind of arguments he was making, but he sort of kind of didn't really believe it to be true or justified, and thought he was somehow like sinning against scientific propriety. The community at the time certainly didn't view his advocacy for this theory as inappropriate or the work as bad in virtue of being false or not being justified in total evidence. And so it seems that Bragg remained an upstanding member of the community, despite the fact that he was putting forward these avowals, which were neither true nor justified nor believed to be as such by that author. And so it seems that, therefore, this is kind of an interesting case where someone was able to sort of reliably go forward making claims, making these avowals about X-rays having a particle component, which wouldn't have met any of the norms of assertion. It'd be inapt, infelicitous, bad qua assertions. But they weren't viewed to be kind of like bad qua contributions to science, bad qua scientific public avowals, bad qua things to conclude in a scientific paper by either the members of his community or, as far as we can tell, subsequent historians or people looking back on the episode. And so, that's interesting to us, at least in at least this case. It seems like, it turns out you can be a perfectly good avowal according to the norms of the scientific community and not be good, not be kosher according to the norms analytic philosophers have surveyed for assertions. And so then the question was, does this generalize? And wouldn't have a talk or a paper if the answer wasn't yes. The answer is yes. But if when we're going to think about why it generalizes, I think that's going to be sort of like telling. It's because of the kind of thing science is as a social enterprise that Bragg's behavior here really was like exemplary qua participant in the scientific enterprise, despite the fact that he was regularly putting forward claims which didn't meet the standards. And so, and it's thinking about like why that is. It's like really interesting. The paper lies, so we claim. Okay, so I had an assumption to justify this. So one of the things we just relied on in that was the claim that how do we know Bragg's the claims weren't just bad claims to make? They were inapt, they were infelicitous. Well, we said because both the scientists at the time and subsequent historians seem to sort of judge Bragg well, no one ever thinks this episode to his discredit, even though we have these letters available to him and correspondence available from him. But we think there's a general play here when you think about what it is for something to be a norm for public avowals or speech norm in general. And we're going to assume that a good norm for public avowals can't rule out as bad or sort of say infelicitous things that would be necessary for scientific communication. So it can't be the case that to be a good member, to do the things which this community needs me to do in order to carry out projects, I need to tell you this. But for the norm for making those assertions, I shouldn't tell you this. We're going to assume that the norms are kind of well adapted to their function in the community. They're well adapted to the social role they should play in regulating the discourse amongst scientists. So that's an assumption we're making, and that's why and that's we'll say, for instance, and we're going to argue that it turns out the reason you can violate the norms of assertion that analytic philosophers have surveyed is because it's good for the enterprise as a whole. That kind of norm functionalism is kind of undergirding our arguments. I should say, in the interest of fairness, this has turned out to be the point where when we show this to analytic epistemologists, they push back on this a lot. It actually is not taken as granted that the norm has to be well adapted to the community in this way. So maybe we can discuss that. I'm not sure what I think about it, but that's our assumption in this paper. Okay. So one of the things going on in the Bragg case is that, I'm kind of moving around in my chair. This is much nicer than giving talks in person. I love it. Okay. One of the things going on in the Bragg case is Bragg and other scientists, it turned out they were using different materials to generate the X-rays, or generate the X-rays, and that made a difference to what they were seeing, and that explained why they were getting different results. But at the time, people didn't know that this difference would make a difference, and so it took doing this kind of work to sort it out. And so this is an example of the division of labor. We had different scientists worked on different materials, and in that way we're able to specialize and get different results. And that was on the whole informative. And that's a general feature of science, where we divide cognitive labor and we have different people explore different experimental procedures, in this case, or different models or different theories. And by dividing themselves up in this way, we're better able to explore. I mean, this is one of the sort of core arguments people in social epistemology have been making for a while now in the social studies of science, that this kind of division of labor, this exploring different things, taking different models or theories as your background assumptions, etc., that's really what allows for the success of science. It's like really vital that we do this thing. Like it's how it is that science can achieve whatever it achieves when it's successful, is by allowing for this specialization and rapid and wide-reaching exploration of logical space. But like a sort of inevitable consequences of this is like either because they're directly just making different theoretical or modeling assumptions, and sort of directly what they're saying will contradict, or because of the kind of thing we're doing science. If you have different experimental procedures, sometimes that will give you systematically different results or things indicative of different claims. But inevitably, you're going to have people contradicting or disagreeing with each other. They're going to come to different results or make different assumptions, or in general, their claims will either directly contradict or quickly entail contradictions. And that's normal. And that's not only normal, but it's vital. And so at least some of these people, assuming the invidious principle of non-contradiction, which I vote for now, but at least some of these people therefore have to be wrong, right? Because they're asserting P and not P, so at least one person has to be wrong. And so if we're right that the division of labor is vital, and given our previous norm, and this is kind of a generalization of what's going on in the Bragg case, if this is always going to be the case, then at least we have to put up with at least some people violating the factive norm. We won't be able to identify who's doing it, but at least someone has to be violating the factive norm, because that's just a kind of inevitable upshot of the division of labor, which is a kind of vital part of science. And so we have to be willing to say, you can like be doing good work and doing exactly what we need you to do for the community to make its epistemic advances, even though sometimes you're going to say false things, or some proportion of you are going to be saying false things. And so we think that like this is an example for where the factive norms are going to go wrong. And it's like, maybe I'll bring it up here, but you could like maybe see the pessimistic meta-induction as kind of another version of this. It's kind of like the division of labor, but temporally spread rather than spread over space or logical space. Like maybe like you could see the pessimistic meta-induction as like the best way we have of like advancing in science is by allotting different generations the task of exploring different bits of logical space, and it's only by them doing what they can do, making the mistakes they make, and us disagreeing with them, that we can make whatever advances we can make, and presumably some of the things we're saying will be mistakes in just this kind of way. And so if you do buy the pessimistic meta-induction, it's kind of it's a version of the same point that oh wait, I just realized I don't know what I can assume from the audience here. So just for people aware, the pessimistic meta-induction is this general argument that very often scientists will be saying false things, and it's just basically an induction on the history of science. If you look at all of the great science of the past, people have frequently been saying things which turn out to be false, but which they weren't able to realize as false at the time, which their evidence seemed to be supporting. And the claim is probably we're in the same situation. And so we're saying what can be seen as underlying that is a similar kind of division of labor point, or at least if anything like that is true, then it looks like we've just accepted that some false things are going to be said as part of the process of science going well. Oh no, I saw the Q&A thing just light it up. Don't hold me to the pessimistic meta-induction. I'll back down immediately. Okay, fine. But like, okay, so you've got the division of cognitive labor point, or you've maybe got the pessimistic meta-induction point, depending on what you think of that. They might infinitely be the same point. But then that gets rid of the factive norms, right? Because that just shows some people have to be saying false things for this to be going well. And I think the next issue, though, which also gets rid of the justificatory norms, is evidence, like a principle governing what counts as being justified or being warranted, like whatever it would be to meet the epistemic norms. We include the total evidence principle. It's like whether or not your claim is justified is really whether or not it's justified relative to all of the evidence, and not just the evidence you've gathered, like as in Bragg's case, but also what other people in the field are doing. In hotly contested cutting-edge science, often that will the kind of the total evidence available to you, both about the kind of process scientific inquiry is, and also about what your peers are doing right now. That can sort of overwhelm your local evidence. That may well happen. In which case, like, for you to publish anything, kind of, there would always be a weight of evidence against you. That, in fact, kind of happened to Bragg, and it can happen plenty of other times too. You could also be looking for something where, there's a lot of noise, and the best methods we have are only going to be so good at cutting through that. And again, sort of, we don't know how to do better than everyone putting out their studies and then trying to do meta studies later. So these are situations which is pretty normal, where like scientists' total evidence will sort of outweigh their particular evidence and speak against whatever conclusion they're coming to. But the only way we'll sort of eventually be in a position to do better is by people still putting forward their claims and like learning from each of the individual subunits and how they seeing what they found and then thinking about like what the total evidence suggests in light of this later. And so often scientists in the position of putting forward a new claim will find the total evidence outweighs them. That's what happened to Bragg, and we think that's fine. That's okay. So just as like it can be perfectly fine to end up saying a false thing because we did division of labor and you got unlucky, so too it can be totally okay to say something which isn't justified given your evidence or isn't warranted given the evidence available, because like we're engaged in this cutting edge research. There's a lot of noise. There's a lot of new things being found out, etc. And any one thing can't really contribute that much justification. And so we think that's a perfectly fine situation too, and that will means there'll be plenty of sort of perfectly acceptable scientific public avowals which wouldn't meet the epistemic norms either. Okay. The next thing is kind of existential claim. So we've got those two things. We've got an argument saying, given a good division of cognitive labor, both spatially and temporally, often people are going to say false things, but it'll be fine. Given, again, the division of cognitive labor, but also given some facts about like what it's like to do cutting edge research, often people will be saying things outweighed by total evidence, and that's fine. And then the last thing is that here's a kind of existential point. It's that we don't think that there can be a requirement that scientists, it can't be normatively required. This is an extra assumption. Maybe I should list this at the front, but like we don't think it can be like, normatively required that scientists be like arrogant or ignorant of the history or state of their field, right? There's that claim that everyone thinks they're a better than average driver, right? Like we don't think that's like normatively required of scientists, that everyone thinks that R.I.P. Newton, but my theories are different. Like that my work is going to be the exception to the pessimistic meta induction, or like I'm just lucky and it's always the case that like the thing my lab group doing is going to turn out to be the correct one, or etc. They can be perfectly aware and still normatively correct, as Bragg was. That like, well, I'm exploring a new thing and the evidence is kind of all over the place right now. But I'm going to put forward this claim because it's what we seem to be finding, and it's good for this claim to have an advocate in light of the fact that some evidence is out there supporting it. Like that's a perfectly fine way to be it. It's not normatively required that you don't be that way. Now, it's not normative. Well, we don't think it's normatively required to be making good scientific avowals that you don't be that way. There are some arrogant scientists I've heard, and there are some scientists who are ignorant of the history or sociology of science, allegedly. And if these things are true, we're not saying that therefore they can never make good public avowals, but we're just saying that it's not normatively required that you don't be that way. And so, these are the kind of things which got us through this. Like, so when we were thinking about these public avowals, we thought that like there can be perfectly good scientific public claims, public avowals, which aren't true. There can be ones which are perfectly good, but which aren't justified, and there can be perfect ones which like the people making them know them not to be, or don't believe them to be true or justified. And allowing for that turns out to be sort of like vital for science to be able to do what it's doing. Like if we were to sort of count that against you, then what we'd be saying is that things which have to happen for science to go well are still bad. Like you shouldn't have done them according to this norm. And we don't think the norm of avowal should sort of mitigate against some purpose in that way. So no, we're not saying, of course, that all claims made by made in conclusion, the scientific public vows. We're not saying they're all false, or all unjustified, or all not believed. We're just saying that it's permissible for them to be. And so sometimes they will be. And so even when things are going well, you can't infer from the fact that something was published that it is true or justified or even believed. I mean, that's kind of interesting for me if someone studies fraud, but even believed, I don't think you can infer that. And so sort of when you're thinking about what kind of science should be reliable or what you can trust or work on the basis of, you have to do sort of more. I mean, it's kind of obvious in some sense, but like it's why it's true. It's like you have to do more than just go from what's been published and before you can trust it. And that's because like science requires that it be the sort of enterprise that that allows for such things. If we're right about division of labor and whatnot, its importance. Okay, so there's an objection which we thought about a lot, and I'm not really sure I agree with our answer to, but like I'll run it past you, see what you think. Which might come, which is that shouldn't scientists just make more cautious claims, right? So like rather than saying mobile phone use went up in Accra in 2007, what they should say is something like, our data suggests mobile phone use went up in Accra in 2007. And that claim might be true or justified or at least believed, right? And so if they were to just kind of like appropriately epistemically hedge their utterances or appropriately hedge them by means of relating them to other claims, then maybe you could get something more like the traditional claims going. And so yeah, that's an objection one might have. There's a couple of things to say to that. One which is, I think, more boring, I'll say it, and then there's more interesting one. So the more boring one is just to lean on what I was just saying about the fact that, we're not saying that all utterances have to be untrue, unjustified, or not believed, just that they can be, and it's okay. And, and informally, we surveyed a bunch of journals, and we found some people would, in their abstracts or in the results section, sometimes in the discussion section, say things in a hedge kind of way. We hypothesize, our data suggests, it seems that, things like that. It seems that it's a bit dodgy, but the other two at least. On the other hand, some people would just make claims along the lines of, in 2007, mobile phone use went up in Accra. Like there was also that kind of unhedged claim. And all we're saying is that like those stronger claims, even if they're not true justified, that can be permissible because it serves this purpose of communicating results by doing that. And so that would be to sort of the kind of boring response. But that's not fully, that's a bit boring. And also you might think, well, the availability of these hedge claims kind of undermines the claim it's strictly necessary to make a stronger claim. And I think that kind of gets to the more interesting point here, which is, okay, so to some extent, gets to like, without, I'm yet to find a way of saying this, which I like, but what matters is like the risky utterance. And that's what we need, the content of a risky utterance. And that's what we need to be communicated and tested. Like what's vital for science isn't this one lab, this one time got something which seems to suggest this, or like these sociologists hang around pawn shops in Accra, so like this many people come in this month in 2007. What we're interested in is the general claim, right? We're interested in mobile phone use, or we're interested in X-rays, or whatever it might be. Or like, so like the kind of thing which prompted the replication crisis, right? Like it wouldn't matter if some undergrad sometime got more confident after they power posed. Oh, you can't see, I was power posing, but just trust me. What matters was the claim there's a general relationship between like positioning your body in this kind of way and one confident on one's performance. And so kind of, so to speak, like even the apparently hedged forms of the claim, what they're communicating, the thing that's necessary for science is that it's the general claim. It's like the work they do is getting people to focus their attention on that claim. And what we're saying is kind of that claim, the thing which we actually care about, the thing which is like what we're really trying to get at, whether we kind of like give the outer form of hedging or not. That claim turns out needn't be true, justified, or believed to be such. And we think that's kind of more interesting. It wouldn't really, you could sort of get something which would like, yeah, okay, technically you said a true thing, or something which might be justified if you made the hedge claim, but it doesn't matter, because what we're going to do is not like, if we're going to try and replicate this, for instance, we're not going to see whether or not you really believed the hedge claim, or whether, well, unless we're worried about fraud, we're probably not going to be looking for like whether your data in particular really justified this. Rather, what we're going to be looking for is whether this can be supported in other cases, or whether we should come to believe it, so to speak. And so that's why, so basically we think that objections shouldn't make hedge claims. It kind of sort of misses the point. It changes the subject somewhat. It's too focused on the outer form of the words rather than their role in the community, the communication that they're actually trying to give past. Let's see what you think. Okay, so I think, let's see, how long has it been? Oh, so it's been about 50 minutes, so 45 minutes. That's okay. I think we're coming close to the bit where we conclude that Hyson and I are correct. So get ready for that. But before that, we say a bit which is positive as well. We're trying to think about like what we think is going on here instead. Like if there is a norm, or we can try and characterize it, which we had to go. So we said, the overall moral is that the social enterprise of inquiry requires we allow people to be more lax in certain contexts we normally require individuals offering testimony. And for a long process of cultural evolution, a community has developed norms of vow to accommodate that fact. So here's what we mean by that. You might think that science is really naturally seen as a place where we hold people to higher standards, right? Like it's the strict epistemic enterprise. And in a sense, that's true. But like I think that the we has to be taken seriously. Collectively, science is a place with very high standards. But the way it does that is it turns out by like, to some extent, like letting people like epistemically get away with making utterances, which in a sense they wouldn't be allowed to. So the reason we think analytic philosophers have often had these kind of factive or epistemic norms is because they're thinking of paradigm assumptions being something like, I ask you when the bus is coming and you tell me. And if you do that, you didn't know when the bus is coming, you failed me, you've been misleading in some way. Like that's the kind of situation. But in inquiry, actually, we can't require that of you, because like if we already knew in that way, it wouldn't be inquiry. And so it just turns out that kind of in a certain sense, we actually kind of lower the standards in a certain sense for scientific public avowals. The question number is going up again. This is awful. It's so scary. This is way more terrifying. I take it back. I don't like online talks. So that's what we think is going on, and we think, as I said, it's kind of functions like we think that like gradually what's happened is, given that inquiry needs this to be successfully carried out, gradually the community has kind of come up with patterns of what is accepted and not accepted, which kind of respect the fact that sort of taking epistemic risks, bold conjectures in proper sense are okay in this context, and so. Our kind of tentative proposal for what a norm which would work would be, this is just awful, but I'm going to read it out anyway. One's avowal must be such that if one's evidence or what one had gathered in a methodologically proper way for one's later study, combined with whatever the mandated subset of the previous literature contains, then one would be justified in believing one's scientific public avowal. So it's a kind of limited epistemic norm, where the idea is you get to like pretend, hypothetically suppose your total evidence were just the evidence you've recently gathered, assuming you've done it properly, and different fields of different norms, but like some subset of the previous literature which you're expected to survey in the previous work section of your paper. So suppose all of your evidence were that. Then would you be justified in coming to whatever conclusion you did? Now, in fact, your evidence won't be that. That won't be your total evidence, because you might know about other work going on, or you might have other studies going on even at a different time. So that needn't be your total evidence, but you like pretend that's your total evidence, and you're also allowed to ignore like the pessimistic meta induction. You don't have to worry about like the overall history of science or something. Then you have to pass an epistemic bar, an epistemic standard to make your avowal on this kind of hypothetical, fictitious total evidence. That's what we think. That's our sort of proposal, I guess, for what like you can infer. And so, like when it was going well, what you can infer is something like this claim would be justified by this kind of imagined total evidence set. And there'll be some work to do for like different fields. Will like have there's a couple of like, things that are just sort of like free variables, so to speak, where different fields will have different things for what counts as methodologically proper, or different the mandated subset of the previous literature. Different fields will fill those things in differently, and that's why you can get some diversity between scientific fields as well. So that's our proposal for what the norm actually is. Interested to hear what you think. And we think that if this were more widely appreciated, it might help with some reflection on scientific communication, psychom. And I think, as I said, just because what initially prompted this was thinking about the replication crisis, and we think that what might be good is for people, for science journalists, and maybe like members of the business community who might be taken in by scientists selling them consultancies they probably shouldn't buy, is if people who do it, like, look, even when things going well, like, this is what an individual study gets you, right? Like, value that as you will, respond to it like that's what you should be responding to. It's like that's what it gets you in the good case. That's what you can infer as a non-expert seeing it. And that's also why I think it might be appropriate to like actually require people to be more explicit, like not just let them get away with saying things which are meeting this strange norm if they're talking to the public, but they have to say, there it does matter that they say like the hedged thing with the appropriate explanation of how it's created. So it has to be sort of true or known maybe. Because the public not being part of the community which has developed these norms will not necessarily know how to respond to it correctly unless it's said explicitly. And so we hope that if this work is developed, then eventually it could have some sort of beneficial results for how we train science journalists or science communicators or people who regularly interact with people like that. Okay, so we asked what sort of epistemic relationship should we have to conclusions of individual scientific papers, and also think about like, really how do scientific papers individually relate to the enterprise of science as a whole. We argued that we don't think they have to be true, justified, or believed to be such, even in the best case. So that was even under our idealizing assumption about things going well. We don't think they have to meet the typical norms of assertion surveyed in analytic epistemology. But rather they're justified to this kind of like field-specific, conventionally specified subset of our total evidence, and that's the situation. Okay, so thank you. Do you have any questions? I think I'm done now.
Right, thank you, Liam, for this wonderful and provocative talk. So let me remind you how we're going to be proceeding. If you have a question, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and then write your name in the just write your name. You don't need to write your question. What I will do is promote you to panelists. It takes a few seconds to transition from attendee to panelist, and you'll be able to be visible and talk to Liam directly instead of me having to do the translation of your question. So right now, the speakers are people with questions are Danielle, Greg, Sandy, Marina, Axel, David, Sam, Mike, and Siddharth. So we'll start with in that order with Danielle, and I'm going to promote you to panelist. Hopefully that works. Here we go. Danielle, if you can turn your cam on, and here you go. Go ahead.
Hi, so that was fascinating. Hi. The one thing I'm wondering about a little, I had a version of the objection you raised, but I wonder if you were just using the wrong hedge. What if scientists were just more cautious, and the hedge they used is exactly the one you say in your conclusion is what should really be in the background? That what they're really saying is, if my data were gathered in the proper way and it was representative of the total evidence, then the conclusion would be such and such. If they said that, suppose people just started saying that at the end of every article, then they would satisfy all the norms, as near as I can tell. It would still draw people's attention to the more interesting proposal, so it would get at that deep sense. And if that were true, that they could just always add that hedge at the beginning, maybe it's just always an ellipses that we're just not bothering to say each time. So it's nothing about the norms of assertion specifically, it's just the content of the conclusion should have this antecedent that we're just always assuming is there. And if that seems implausible for science, it seems much more plausible for philosophy. I feel like all the time when you talk to philosophers and you push them, they'll say, yeah, well, what I'm really saying is that if my arguments are good and they represent the evidence, then like this is an interesting view worth exploring. I think Castaneda was famous for saying that explicitly about his like idealism, that this is just like a fun thing to look at. So why not think that? Why not think that this is just always, your very proposal is just always an elliptical element of scientific conclusions, or could be read into scientific conclusions in a way that wouldn't require actually changing the norms behind what counts as good science. Does that make sense?
Good. It makes sense. Thank you very much for the question. I'm going to answer 2 points. So it's a couple of things that was interesting to me. Well, there was lots that was interesting to you, but there's a couple of things which I'm going to answer. The first point is, if we're right, we don't think there's a change in scientific norms required. We think scientific norms have already evolved to this. And so I guess, yeah, I think you're right. It's probably a consequence of what's saying that if we're right, therefore, you could convert the conclusions in good cases into true statements, which would be like specifying our norm. And so I guess that would be possible, and that would be an upshot of our thesis. I don't think we can deny that. And so, and this is the thing I think we're still working out when we want to how to frame this picture. Like, a lot of how I present things and also how we do it in the paper suggests that like our interest is really in the norms of assertion, and so like what the specific speech act being done is. But we're really just using that as a means of exploring like what to actually conclude from that. And so ultimately we don't really, as long as kind of everyone knows what's going on, either implicitly because they've been inculcated into this community and just kind of you learn how we're meant to really respond to things, or explicitly because we just introduce a new norm of saying it. Like, we think it's kind of interesting to note that this is what's going on, whether it's made explicit or not. Now, there may be, so like the reason I don't just say that, therefore, like, oh, well, maybe you could do that, is actually, like, I might be kind of sympathetic to requiring this being done more as part of the SciComm thing, like in fields at least where there's some chance that people are going to take up your work. It might actually be good to try and introduce the norm of like, no, it can't be implicit. Like, if this is true, you have to like say it. And I, that's just that's a thing worth thinking about. I'd like to think about it more, so we've got it at the end, but I'm sympathetic. I mean, all I can say right now is I'm sympathetic to it, but I'm not sure what I think. One of the other interesting things you said was about like whether it's plausible in philosophy as well. See, yeah, so one of the things we should do is be a bit more precise what we mean by science, because we don't think this is going to go for every field. And I did a bit of hedging on that when I said, has to be like a field going well, so phrenology doesn't count. I do with the hand gestures. But like, it also might not be true for other things. Like, presumably in mathematics, like, a proof has to make the claim true. Like, I take it. Like, maybe, I don't know. That's plausible to me. And it's funny enough, you said in philosophy, I actually thought in philosophy, maybe you do have the total evidence things is like, actually, you're kind of not, it's less allowed in philosophy to say like, oh, that consideration just isn't relevant. We're not thinking about that here. Like, if a philosopher is writing about science, they really do have to take into account the pessimistic meta-induction. Or in general, so philosophers are kind of called to look at how things in the broadest sense hang together in the broadest sense. And that might actually disallow people from saying, well, I'm only looking at this thing. They have to sort of make a strong claim about it. I'm not sure about that. But in any case, I do think it's going to be different for different fields, although I actually think it might end up being stricter in certain fields in philosophy. And that actually might be part of why philosophy doesn't make progress in any acceptable way, because we don't allow ourselves this kind of division of labor where some people get their concerns screened off.
Maybe that all sounds good. I just do want to flag, as far as philosophy goes, just as a sociological fact, that I frequently got in journal acceptances that say things like, this is totally wrong, but it advances the conversation in an interesting way and points to a research area worth exploring, which suggests that they're interpreting my results as having this sort of hedge that you think specifically doesn't apply to philosophy. And maybe I've just gotten lucky with journal reviewers.
Maybe I've just gotten unlucky. I'm the abolished journals guy, and maybe that's as well. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
We've got 11 more people, so we're going to be moving on, and be mindful that there are a lot of people. So Sandy, you're going to be next once I'm promoting you, if I find you on the list of... All right, Sandy Mitchell is going to be next. Hello, Sandy.
Okay, hi. Thank you.
Sandy.
Thanks, Liam, and Hyson, if you're listening in. I think that was really interesting. You clearly point to a situation that is not uncommon. It's rather common and, in fact, should be supported in scientific practice about trying out risky hypotheses for which the even existing evidence at the time is not supporting this kind of strong and strict view of the conditions for assertion. But I wonder if your solution is too permissive, because what you do by allowing anything, you can just, it struck me, maybe I'm wrong, so correct me, that what you're saying is that, you're permitted to violate the strict rules, right? Be lax on the strict rules if this hypothetical condition holds, namely, if the total evidence did support it, it would be assertable under the strict rules. The trouble is that lets in, at least the way I heard it, that lets in way too much. And I think there's a better solution that maybe recognizes that there's even norms for risky research practices. So we don't think it's okay, for example, that even though the evidence is against me, I'm going to push the hydroxychloroquine theory, right? Again and again and again and again and again. And as the evidence piles up against me, it says, but it's okay, because if the evidence was in my favor, it would support this claim. So I think that exposes that there's even norms that apply to the risky science situation that gets kind of occluded by your solution being only, well, this hypothetical way of justifying it without specifying what things for risky science are.
Yeah, good. Okay, so you slightly misstated what our norm was. However, your counterexample is still a counterexample to our thing. So, yeah. So our thing wasn't just like, if the total evidence supported it, but rather it's a condition of what the total evidence, how you suppose the total evidence to be. It's like the total evidence, if it consisted of whatever results I've gathered with my lab, with the study, and also whatever the previous literature said. And the problem is that someone who, it is kind of plausible to me that someone might be able to meet that condition, because they keep generating new studies, which they're the only person in town who does this. They keep generating new studies which support, I'm going to say a quack treatment. Is that edgy? But whatever, I'm in the UK, I'm safe. So they keep supporting a quack treatment. And eventually, the community is going to say, like, look, this is not good, stop it. I need to think about that more. So my initial thought is something like, this is interacting with the problem of inductive risk. And what's going on in something like that is our evidential, given the public interest in that kind of thing, our evidential threshold will change, and that might be, for instance, like changing what kind of evidence you have to be consistent with, and that's going to make a difference here. But that is like the barest sketch of how to respond. Like, really, I just need to think about a case more. That's my instinct. Thank you for the question. It's a good point.
Right, Marina, you're next.
Hey, thank you so much for the talk, and thanks, Hyson, for your contribution. I'm wondering, sort of on the other side of Sandy's too permissive line, I wonder how far we could get with something like an adequacy for purpose norm, and whether that would be a norm of assertion or a norm of utterance in this context. And a sort of follow-up to that is, I wonder if the purpose could be contributing to some kind of like bets hedging, division of labor in the way that you described. So I'd love to hear from you if you think that that's apt and what might come out of that.
Well, can you say a bit more about an adequacy for purpose norms?
So oftentimes in like a modeling context, we have idealized assumptions that we like make without regard for their truthfulness, right? But we would put forward a model as adequate for a particular purpose in a given context. And we would not even expect it. No one would expect it to be true in any like strong sense of that word. So I'm wondering if we could have like first or second order adequacy for purpose norms on scientific communication that might apply to things like models, among others.
Oh, good. Right. So the idea there would be the utterance is acceptable just in case it's sort of concluding such, given what you've done, is fit for the purpose of advancing conversations. It's good for moving things forward. Again, I need to think about that more. That's an interesting proposal. It does cohere nicely for people doing modeling. I agree. I don't know how much this should count, because maybe this is too internalist of me. I have the slight worry that requires scientists. Scientists. I'd be an expert in organic chemistry if I'm an organic chemist, and I'm good at working out whether or not claims are justified by the kind of evidence you gather in organic chemistry. Whereas this adequacy for purpose, where the purpose is that kind of social epistemic one, requires quite like a difficult kind of quasi-sociological calculation. Now, maybe that doesn't matter because we should be externalist about norms and not internalist, and it doesn't matter if the scientist knows they are. But yeah, I don't like externalism; it's a dodge. So I'm worried about that. So that's my initial response. I think.
Unmute. Greg, you're next.
Okay, yes, thank you. My question is incredibly sociological and analogous, and I don't know if it's just for future reference, but I think in many cases you have found a lot of analogies with the field of law, especially in the Anglo-American adversarial legal system. And you could, in many places, sort of put lawyer or attorney in for scientist and normative fields of law in for normative fields of science. And you can get many of the same conclusions in terms of assertions and in that sense. Just a thought, including the fact that the X-ray scientist acted a lot like a lawyer there. And even in law, lawyers who sort of like get away with something are sometimes considered to be prominent in their field. So just a thought. I don't know. That's a very sociological. That's just for future reference.
Oh, thank you. Oh no, you're gone. But thank you. I agree. There was something. I'd have to check again. Check if I sin. But I think. I think Bragg explicitly, his words were. Someone should put the case forward for this or something like that. So he was kind of making legal analogies in his own case. And so I think I can see the base of it. But I'm afraid I don't know, and I don't know, I still knows about this, but I know of myself that I don't know much about the legal situation. And so maybe that would be helpful to me if you could write some of those thoughts down and email them to me.
Sure, but just basically, in other words, a lawyer takes a certain amount of facts and spins them together in a narrative, and then either lets people draw the conclusion or advocate, well, ideally in the law case, advocates the conclusion. I don't know if scientists are advocates as much, but you sort of end there by taking away your head, sit there and say a scientist is advocating something by taking facts and stories in the way that they've been, just a significant amount of similarity there.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Axel, you're next.
Hi. Thank you, Liam. This was great. So I'm going to try to help your case against the.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, because I agree, right? Because I like that it's become clear that there is a part of the project that is actually empirical, because the question whether these avowals are assertions or not has to do with how we actually do it, right? So that's why it's important to look at the text, whether these hedges are explicit or not implicit, and things like that. And I think another evidence of current scientific practice that probably would go your way is that once we start defending a hypothesis, we scientists, we usually you cannot easily change from one hypothesis to another, from paper to paper, right? That's kind of not current practice. I don't know why, but at least your hypothesis explains it, right? Because there is a kind of role playing where your role now is committed to this hypothesis, and that makes it, if not an actual belief, close enough to be belief-like that you need to be somehow committed to it. So I think that would be also good evidence, more closer to empirical evidence to your hypothesis.
That's great. I like that. Can all of the questions be like this? Good stuff. Thank you.
All right, David.
Thanks. This is kind of a variant of Sandy's question. So I can think of cases in physics where we're very clearly in the kind of, this is purely epistemic, there are no relevantly practical questions, where some bit of evidence just seems to change the game. So for instance, running up to the discovery of the Higgs boson, it was perfectly in order and perfectly legitimate and actual to publish various papers constructing or exploring or discussing the evidence for Higgsless models of the electroweak sector, where there just wasn't going to be a Higgs particle. Now, I think if you try to publish any such article more than a year or so after the discovery of the Higgs boson at the LHC, you wouldn't have got it published, or at the very least, you wouldn't have got it published unless you paid assiduous attention in the paper to the fact that apparently we'd found the damn Higgs boson. So again, that seems to be similar in Sandy's case, a place where just there's a chunk of evidence that seems solid enough you're just not allowed to set it aside. I mean, I use the physics example partly because it's, again, that for all the importance of finding the Higgs boson, it clearly has no near-term practical or social implications. So it does seem that the answer would have to be internal to the epistemic norms of the subject.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. So I think what this shows, and I think, yeah, you're right, there's a link to Sandy's questions also, but both of your points show is that we kind of, both in the talk and kind of in the paper too, when we're giving our proposal, we don't say much about that kind of mandated subset of the previous literature, which is this. But like there are sort of obviously kind of interesting things going on there which make a big difference to when it's acceptable to put something forward. Because like, yeah, at least some things can be sufficiently salient, as in the discovery of the Higgs boson, that you just kind of have to take it into account. Or they can be, as in the I can't pronounce the word, the COVID cure thing, or they can be like that, where it's of sufficient public importance that you just have to take it into account. But there's something going on that you just, and so, yeah, I don't, this is just a good point, and we don't yet have what those norms are, so thank you for raising it.
But there could be a broader concept of salience that could have sufficiently strong epistemic influence on it, but could also have practical...
yeah, absolutely. It could be either depending on the field.
I mean, that sounds like a plausible kind of sketch as to what the answer would look like. Yes, cool, thank you.
Thanks. Sam Fletcher, the floor is yours.
Hey, Liam. I was hoping I could ask you to draw out some implications of your conclusion for the thing that originally started you to think about it, which is the replication crisis. So if it's really the case that so the norm or some version of it, maybe perhaps along the lines of some of the emendations that people have suggested or whatever, is the actual norm that's in play, say, in social psychology. It then raises the question, why are people in social psychology therefore so upset? If they understood the norm, right, why would they be surprised or conflicted about what's happened? It seemed that it would then have an implication for one of the assumptions that you started off with, which is that a scientific community is well ordered in a certain sort of sense. If that's right, I was hoping maybe then you think that, does this work have any implications for the way in which disciplines that do have replication crises and see themselves as having that have implications for the way in which they're not well ordered? Or do you see that there's maybe something else that's going wrong in those sorts of cases?
Okay, thank you, Sam. I was half expecting you to say, I was wondering if I could ask you to answer your damn emails. I'm so sorry, Sam. I like you, and I'm very sorry. But okay, I was actually, anyway. Yes, I think you've picked up on exactly what I'd say. I'd say that when I said that there are lots of things going to replicate cases, I think one of the things the replication crisis revealed for some fields, for instance, social psychology, is that there was more like straightforward malpractice, like sometimes actually and often sort of on the edge of being fraudulent behavior, and also like aspects of the field, even if they weren't sort of individual malpractice, were like on the whole not well arranged, and so the file drawer effect was particularly strong. Where like that's showing that the field as a whole isn't well ordered in this kind of way, and so I think that what's going on is at least in some of the cases where we have a replication crisis. Really, it's one of the idealizing assumptions is false, and the field as a whole isn't achieving its epistemic aims. That said, I think and this is where it will have application, which is why we stress the psychom. I also think that some of what's going on is that the replication crisis is partly become a thing by like extra scientific interest in these things and it appearing in the press. There's been lots of popular articles about it, for instance. That's not the only thing. I don't mean to claim that. There really is this kind of failure of well-orderedness. but I think that is really happening because people just like don't know, like they're being sometimes actually I think they're being taken advantage of by scientists basically who are selling them things which they shouldn't be buying. And so it's all TED Talks fault could be like an alternate title, but like I think that where we're going to be most directly relevant is in those kind of cases where like the difference between the internal norm and what people normally expect of assertions or how they understand scientific conclusions is what's going to be going on. But that's where we're going to be most directly. Indirectly, I think what's going on is when you get kind of internal to the field panic about the replication rate, that's because people are aware that it's not internally well ordered. I actually think a very good example of this is medicine, which is various bits of medicine have also had a replication crisis. And it seems to be like very related to the role of industry in promoting certain things over others. It's kind of just, there are structural features about how this field is like funded and carried out, which is just leading to it getting worse results. And so I think sometimes what we're just finding is the failure of the well-orderedness assumption. That's which is just what you said. So thank you.
All right, good. Yeah.
Mike, the floor is yours.
Hi. This was a lot of fun. I started off early in the talk being more concerned than I think I've wound up. But I'm interested in, I guess, a little bit more of the motivation that might have caused me to not be as worried at the start. So I would have thought coming into this, not coming from the analytic philosophy of language side, that whereas concerns about utterances boil down to either speech acts or propositions, or the relevant atomics are the statements. In science, when you look at the part-whole setup, the parts, the atomics, end up being papers, not the further reduction to the various utterances that are made throughout the paper. And then the reason why by the end of the talk I wasn't nearly as concerned as when I started is because the sci-com versus scientist talking to scientist distinction kind of sounded like this, where your positive account for within science was much more holistic with regards to a paper as a unit, whereas the sci-com involved the further need to export individual claims. Is that just a different way you might have started the whole conversation and you didn't, or is there a further issue there?
No, I mean, so I think that's broadly right. That's basically tracking the same things we're tracking. I'd make one small adjustment though, which is that I do think that, like, I don't know whether it's an interesting fact, but I think it's true and maybe worth exploring. I'm not sure. That different elements of scientific papers do seem to be held to characterize different norms. We can look at subdivision. For instance, like the bit where you report your data, like that, at least that better be believed, but probably that just better be accurate. Like it better be that when you say I found this, you really found that. And if you don't do that thing, there's a norm been violated, and we're gonna talk about it. It's certainly if you don't believe that you did it, we're gonna have a talk. And so it does. And whereas I don't think that's true for the conclusion. So if we found Bragg's letters, for instance, where he had been saying, yeah, I said I found this in my experiment, but I didn't really find that, that would have seriously impacted his reputation as a scholar. And so it does seem to be like there's something to be said about sub-elements of the paper and like being held to different norms. So like there's something special to conclusions. But that said, we do ultimately think that, the interest is in the relation of the subunit to the whole, and the subunit is the paper really, or not necessarily a paper, but like a more extended thing than just the concluding proposition. And our norm is meant to sort of cover the relationship of that concluding proposition to the extended argument or paper or conference talk or whatever. And so like ultimately I do think we agree with you, but with the caveat that there's maybe some kind of interesting thing to say about the sub elements of papers.
Great. I guess the only other thing I would then add to that is I'd be interested in whether you can ever properly subdivide in such a way that you've separated out the references cited in a section from the section. Given how you phrased your positive thesis involving the sort of appeals to the broader context that it's being situated in.
I haven't thought enough about that, so I'm sorry I can't say. But yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Garth, you're the next one.
So I wanted to ask about a line of inquiry that I'm not sure have you said anything about that. So my concern is something about whether we are being a little bit too quickly fooled by the surface level syntactic structure of the sentences that are being used. So scientists are using these declarative sentences, and I am convinced by your arguments and just from general familiarity with scientific discourse that often scientists use these declarative sentences without sincerely believing that they're true or that they're justified, and therefore they don't count as assertions. But clearly, they do sometimes make these declarative sentences with those sincere beliefs of truth or justification. David had the example of the Higgs boson discovery, and recently there was the discovery of gravitational waves. I think if you look at those papers, it's pretty clear that they sincerely believe them, and in fact, the audience immediately took them to be true and justified. So the kind of inquiry that I think is interesting is to ask what are the other contextual cues or factors that indicate when scientists are really making assertions or they're making these kinds of more programmatic statements about what are interesting lines of inquiry. So how do we sort of distinguish between them? And for members of the community, it's often pretty clear which one it is, but for members of the public, much less so, or even sort of people not in that very specific subfield. So yeah, I just wanted to ask you about whether you have anything to say about that. Thank you.
Oh, no, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. And we thought a little bit about it. I don't want to pin Haisin on this. I'm not sure if she agrees with me, but so I thought a bit about it. So my sense, I've been under a slightly different aspect from the way you described it. Like I've been thinking about like what are sort of like when should scientists update on something? So I read another paper, and let's say because I'm rational, I agree with Liam, and so I think that the conclusion of this paper is correct, and you know something being published just means it's met this norm. Under what conditions should this be something which I myself come to believe, or rather versus should I just think, okay, well, maybe that's worth exploring then, or something like that? And I've been wondering if the conditions are something like the right kind of triangulation or the right kind of multiple lines of inquiry lining on the same thing, where like what needs to happen is enough bits of logical space are covered such that like my various lines of inquiry are all pointing at this thing, or where they're not, I have some explanation as to why they're not. And I mean, that's something like what happened in the Bragg, and I wonder how general that is. Now, I think the difficult thing for me here is I think this is going to also differ from field to field. So in physics, which I don't know as much about, there are specific norms for when you're allowed to like claim that something's been discovered rather than you've got evidence for it or something like that. But that's in parts of physics. And